That is working. It's working. Okay, so the microphone's working. That's good. Welcome everybody. Thanks a lot for coming along. Hopefully everyone has a seat. There are some tables up the back there. If you are missing a seat, we put the tables out so you can sit on the tables if you get tired of standing up. So apologies for the lack of seating. So firstly, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Turtle people as the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, and elders both past and present. I also recognise those whose ongoing effort to protect and promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures will leave a lasting legacy for future elders and leaders. So, even though mental health advocates actively fight stigma associated with mental illness, BPD remains one of the field's most misunderstood, misdiagnosed and stigmatised conditions. BPD Awareness Week aims to address these issues through coordinated national BPD awareness events in states across Australia, as well as media presence and attention, hence our event today. The theme for BPD Awareness Week this year is Best Practice Deserved. People diagnosed with BPD deserve to receive evidence-based treatment, which is best practice. Unfortunately, due to many reasons, best practice treatment is not available for the majority of consumers diagnosed with BPD. Despite the limitations in service provision, there are many professionals in Brisbane who are dedicated to improving this situation, as are us at the Mental Health Professional Networks. Across Metro North, Metro South and Ipswich West Moreton Public Mental Health Services, best practice is not only deserved, but it's also delivered in the form of fully adherent DBT programs which we offer across the three services. Although these programs only care, unfortunately, for a fraction of the people diagnosed with BPD, we are very proud of our programs and we continually work towards improvement. Today we are excited to share with you a variety of things BPD and DBT related. I hope you enjoy the presentations. So, I've changed the agenda up a little bit from the original invite. We're going to have our lovely Sarah Wales talking first about her personal experience of BPD and DBT. And then Melissa Kent will talk about our exciting research project that we're running at the moment across Metro North and Metro South. We are going to spend maybe a couple of minutes just mentioning some ideas for future research and our ideas about better program implementation across the services. And then lastly, I'm going to teach you a tip skill, a very quick skill, which should be interesting. And then at 12 o'clock we'll close. And at 12 o'clock, please feel free to hang around and network and have a chat as you like. So I'd like to introduce Sarah Wales. After collecting an assortment of diagnoses, anorexia, eating disorder not otherwise specified, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorder, and borderline personality disorder, Sarah shares her lived experience in the hope that it may contribute to a greater understanding of mental health and an improvement in treatment outcomes. She is passionate about the development of resources and services to support those recovering from disordered eating and has authored the book Meal Support, the Recovery Resources Package, and is the founder of a website, Recovery Resources. She is also involved in consumer advocacy. Sarah now leads a full life with her 2 children and in her spare time enjoys playing netball, pursuing artistic endeavours and engaging with her local church and deaf communities. Please extend a warm welcome for Sarah. Okay. Thank you for the... Can you hear me if I don't hold the microphone? Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the invitation to share with you some of my journey today. It's a real privilege to actually be able to stand here before some of you who've actually been a part of that journey. So for those who don't know me, let me give you a little bit of a background.
So I've been in and out of the mental health system, more often in and out, for over 20 years. My primary presentation historically centred around my eating disorder, so subsequent treatment therefore focused on weight and nutrition restoration, usually via nasogastric feeds. However, my eating disorder was initially not so much about size, weight, shape and food, although I endeavoured to convince myself and others of this otherwise, but it was a maladaptive coping strategy. See, I survived a rather traumatic and tumultuous childhood, and my eating disorder, which began to take root at around 11 years of age, provided me with a sense of stability, security and control in an otherwise unpredictable and scary world. I learnt to despise any needs or desires, and by avoiding food, I was able to deny and take control of one of humanity's greatest primal needs. Creating food rules and rigidly controlling my intake provided a distraction and numbed the intense feelings that previously overwhelmed me. I strived to starve myself perfectly. However, due to a deeply rooted sense of inadequacy, nothing was ever enough. I could always do better. Essentially, death became the only measure of success. It wasn't just food I deprived myself of though, as from about the age of 12 I began depriving myself of water, going days without fluids, till passing out on the netball court, dehydrated and exhausted. I'd also sticky tape my eyelids open to refrain from potentially closing my eyes and succumbing to the need to sleep. Within a very short period of time, these behaviours became life-threatening, necessitating a hospital admission. However, upon admission, my ED, self-harm and suicidal behaviours rapidly escalated, requiring forced compliance, security assistance, physical restraint, pharmacological sedation and punitive approaches. The treating team's forceful approach to battle my eating disorder and other behaviours generated a power struggle in which I actively worked against them, increasing the intensity of such behaviours. It's a pretty poor analogy, but the best conceptualisation I could come up with is that of a tree. The most obvious part of the tree, that which is easily seen, are the branches and leaves. This is akin to my eating disorder. It was generally the presenting issue, the reason for which I was admitted to hospital, and the focus of intervention and treatment. But just as when you prune a tree, it grows back, often more virulently. Likewise, treatment targeted purely at trying to eliminate my ED behaviours or challenge my ED cognitions was short-lived. I'd get well enough to be discharged, only to have my ED branches grow back quite rapidly, requiring yet another admission. The second level of approach to my treatment was assuming that the roots of the ED were based in my complex trauma history. While this is accurate to an extent, attempting to engage me in therapy of this nature triggered my ED responses, and I inevitably resorted to maladaptive coping strategies, which then required drastic intervention as it rapidly became a life or death situation. What Danae and the team here were able to identify was that in fact, the ED, although my presenting diagnosis, was not my primary one, but rather a symptom or outlet for my BPD. Recognising that I struggled to tolerate emotions or distress and used my ED and self-deprivation to distract, alleviate anxiety, numb emotions, shed a new light on how treatment might be more effective for me. So I kind of envisaged the roots to be the BPD and the soil to be the invalidating environment and trauma that allowed the BPD roots to flourish. Through DBT, I gained knowledge and skills which specifically targeted the BPD roots of emotion dysregulation, inability to tolerate distress, and so forth. I want to look a little bit at my DBT journey with you shortly, but first I just want to mention that although the BPD diagnosis allowed me for more targeted treatment and afforded me the opportunity to engage in the 12-month DBT program here, it came with a whole host of misconceptions and stigma. There seems to be a prevalent misunderstanding that people with borderline personality disorder have some kind of personality flaw, that we're manipulative, unwilling to help ourselves, that it is a choice, and that we're perpetrators of our own misfortune as opposed to victims of past injustice. Interestingly though, there is a near ubiquitous and inextricable link between BPD and trauma. BPD is a complex response to trauma. Yes, we can be hard to deal with and don't always engage with initial treatment, but that doesn't mean we aren't deserving of compassion and kindness. Previously, I'd also been diagnosed with complex PTSD. However, the attitudes of clinicians and the general public to such a diagnosis is usually one of compassion and kindness and seeking to understand and listen. Unfortunately, this attitude often doesn't translate to treatment of BPD, and it's common to elicit a response from doctors or nurses that is fraught with frustration or contempt. Just last year, after a series of PTSD triggers, in a situation where the worker supporting me at the time was unaware of how to respond when I was dissociating, called an ambulance and sent me to hospital. The mere thought of being sent to hospital to the emergency department became overwhelming, and I shifted from a hypo dissociated state, where I was frozen and unable to communicate, to a hyper arousal, highly anxious, sensory overloaded state, where I quickly resorted to old patterns of behaviour to try and calm myself, including banging my head, pacing, self-injury, trying to drown out all sound and light. Upon arrival at the hospital, I completely spun out, and my distress and subsequent behaviours escalated, requiring multiple security guards, 4-point restraints and heavy sedation. When I was eventually transferred to the psych-intensive care unit, I hid myself in the cupboard, trying to reduce all stimulation and to calm myself. Due to standard safety protocol, the night shift staff could not allow me to remain in the cupboard, but I was in complete overload at this point, and my prefrontal cortex had gone completely offline. I continued to try any method possible to self-harm or kill myself, and unfortunately, the night shift nurse responded in a way that further escalated my distress and my behaviours. I was stripped naked by male security guards, thrown a seclusion gown, had my long hair completely hacked off, verbally shamed and guilted, told I was wasting her time, taking up space in a bed that someone who was actually unwell and wanted to get well would better utilise, then left alone and deprived of any dignity. This compounded my trauma and PTSD. Had the mental health nursing staff that were on had a little more training around BPD and approached me with less stigma and more compassion, patience and understanding, I'm confident that I would have responded in a way that would have not required such physical force and restraint. I believe I would have responded much better to a less restrictive practice. Since this time, a new safety and coping plan has been created, outlining what action a support worker can take if they were to encounter me in a similar situation in the future. This document outlines what it looks like when I dissociate, why sending me to hospital should be the last port of call, not the first, how to support me to come back online, and when it does become necessary to call an ambulance. I'd also like to mention that if mental health had their own purpose-built emergency or triaging space that was low stimulus, I also wouldn't have escalated to the point that I did, as the ER environment can really exacerbate the distress of someone who is mentally unwell. So the ongoing stigma and lack of understanding of BPD in the community can also be seen in recent interactions that I had with both Child Safety and Women's Legal Service. Last week at Women's Legal Service, a lovely social worker was assisting me in putting together an application for legal aid. She asked me what my mental health diagnoses were and began typing them in: CPTSD, HXAN, and then when it came to BPD, she paused and she was like, "Do you really want to include that? Maybe you should just leave that one out." And I was just thinking, why is it that CPTSD is viewed with compassion and kindness, with the understanding that it is a response to one having been the victim of a significant trauma, but BPD is viewed as an inherent fault or character flaw that one should be ashamed of and is surrounded by so much stigma? Likewise, during a recent meeting at Child Safety, while similarly being treated with respect and dignity. The team leader, the underlying beliefs about BPD came out when the team leader, who was really well-meaning, stated that although I will never recover from mental illness, and it's something I will have to live with for the rest of my life, and although I will probably always need admissions to hospital every so often, that it doesn't disqualify me from being able to parent effectively when I'm well, and we just need to make plans for when I'm unwell or in hospital. So yes, I will probably always need to err on the side of caution and keep on top of things, to keep short accounts with myself, and perhaps work a little more harder or more strategically than someone who hasn't had a history of mental illness. But I fully believe I can live a life worth living, be functioning and contributing to society, be skillful and not constantly living one step away from crisis point. I believe recovery is possible. I'd like to take a bit of time now just to give you some authentic examples of my processing prior to, during and post DBT. As I read through some old journals, I noticed and highlighted some things in this entry from 2012 that was typical of hundreds, thousands of entries. In blue, you'll see typical statements such as, I'm so fat, I need to lose weight, I don't want to eat anymore, I want to starve. But what I noticed for the first time was that it was almost always preceded with what I've highlighted in yellow. An emotion or underlying issue such as fear, perfectionism, uncertainty, low self-esteem, hopelessness. Time and again, as soon as I experienced such emotion or distress, my ED cognitions rose to the surface to distract from the discomfort of what I was really experiencing. I also noted in the green highlighter that the other aspect that almost always featured alongside my emotions and ED thoughts were suicidal ideations. Starvation for me was about self-harm, punishment, and death. So pretty much every time I found myself overwhelmed with emotion, stress, distress, I would act according to my ED and or suicidal thoughts. As I began to engage in DBT and learn more effective skills, my behaviours began to shift and my insight into the feelings that underlay my impulsive and extreme urges grew. Here's an excerpt from an email that I sent to Danae a month into the program. I'm really distressed and I really want to hurt myself and I want to say screw it to all the skills and throw them away and I want to act on my thoughts and harm myself and smash my head and slice myself open. It's all so strong and it feels too hard to use my skills. I need to calm down. My anxiety is really high. I don't like being like this. Don't worry, all just thoughts, images, feelings, and venting. No specific plans. Several months into my DBT, this email to Danae shows the progress I've made. Okay. Oh, yeah. I just had an appointment, but it was with the doctor I hadn't met before and male. This usually leaves me feeling really vulnerable. And this start where I'm feeling particularly so. When I feel this, intense shame surfaces, which leads to ED, self-harm, suicidal thoughts. It's very unsettling and I feel really raw. I'm working through my skills to try and manage the distress and not act on anything. I'm pretty confident I won't act on the intrusive thoughts and feelings. I just don't like feeling this way and it's unsettling. But I'm also using encouragement to remind myself that I can get through it, that they are just feelings and can't hurt me, and that I've navigated feeling like this before and come through okay, trying to be proactive in using my skills. A little later on in DBT, here's another email to Danae that shows further progress. After our session, I was feeling much better, but as soon as I got home, that all flew out the window and I was about to crumble. I thought, I can't do this. I felt really overwhelmed and was on the verge of falling apart. So I stopped and I thought about what we talked about and what is, isn't, and hasn't been effective, and about emotional mind, wise mind. I decided to give the new way a go, so I got back in my car and drove to a park around the corner. I just sat in the car with the windows down and practiced some mindfulness, observing the trees, feeling the wind. I had such a good and refreshing rest, And then when I eventually headed back home, surprise, surprise, I felt so much better and had a productive afternoon. So not long after completing DBT, I had my gorgeous son Joshua, but this was not without its challenges and stresses. In a particularly difficult time, I emailed Danae the following. I'm doing okay and have successfully navigated the crisis point. I'm trying to work mostly on my please factors, the stress tolerance to hopefully allay the escalation of distress and some radical acceptance, hoping that will help keep things at bay. Also practicing some mindfulness to try slow thoughts down and be present to the precious moments with Joshua, which helps with calming myself down and shifting perspective, distracting. Grateful for my DBT skills at the moment, otherwise an admission would have been required. So here's one more excerpt from an email I sent Danae a year post DBT. Just to give you a bit of background, in the previous few months I'd experienced numerous stresses, including moving house, being in a car accident, my husband ODing, 3 friends committing suicide, and a whole host of other ups and downs. Historically, any one of those things would have been enough to send me spiralling. I'm not going to read the whole excerpt for the sake of time, but I just want to bring your awareness to a few key points as highlighted in purple. I'm getting better at identifying my feelings, and then I'm able to observe them and accept that they are what they are. I'm improving and extending compassion to myself. I readily recognise the importance of keeping on top of my please factors, like eating, sleeping, taking my meds. I can identify when I need some time out, and I'm succeeding more often in being proactive to make it happen, not waiting for forced rest in an admission. I have a toolkit that I can rummage through and pull out what is needed to help at any given moment to avoid things getting to crisis point. And the question of, is this effective, is constantly on the forefront of my mind, helping me to align myself with wise mind. One area that I continue to struggle with, however, was utilising self-soothing senses. During my most recent admissions, however, I had the privilege of working with the OT to complete a sensory profile. Yeah, there we go. And explore what helps to activate, alert me, and what helps to calm me. We then identified several specific items that worked for me. Along with that, I printed off a couple of different handouts and overviews of the DBT skills with a brief explanation of each and how to apply them. I highlighted ones that are particularly useful in crisis moments. I also gathered copies of my safety plan and a list of contacts. I collated it all and created a sensory modulation and tools box, which permanently sits on the chest in my dining living area. Inside this box, in addition to the documents, are tangible items that support me to come back online when I'm frozen, to calm down when I'm highly distressed, and to remind me to use my DBT skills and to take time out to self-care. For example, within my box are items that represent the various senses. So I've got instant hot and cold packs that can be used for tip skills. I've got fidget toys, citrus scented candle, mug with some tea bags, suspended glitter jars that we made together, fruit tingles, bubbles for breathing and mindfulness exercise, a journal, watercolour paints, photos of my kids, earplugs, and several other things. I also have a travel kit that I take with me, which one of the participants in the audience is holding onto it for me at the moment. Now when I find myself, my distress escalating, or I'm beginning to sense myself on the verge of dissociation, I access my box, revise my skills, pick relevant items to help soothe the senses and bring me back into that window of tolerance. All of my support workers are aware of the box's contents and how to assist me in the utilisation of them. So, I kind of conceptualised my BPD recovery journey in 4 parts. For ease of recollection, and because who doesn't love a good alliteration, I've coined each phrase or phase with word beginning with the letter B. So, phase 1 is really about managing behaviours. It was about developing the skills to adjust my life-threatening, self-destructive and therapy-interfering behaviours. And that was what DBT was all about. Phase 2 was about identification and awareness of core beliefs. So they underpin a lot of my ways of being, responding and interacting. The internal subconscious dialogue that I told myself as a child, messages which became deeply held narratives that I'm unworthy of love, attention, success or happiness, were reinforced by a traumatic and invalidating background. Engaging in some schema therapy helped to identify themes such as defectiveness, shame, self-sacrificing, unrelenting standards and subjugation, which with awareness I could then challenge. So the third phase, background. Now that I've become pretty okay with the DBT skills and consolidated my usage of them so that my behaviours are under control and my core beliefs identified, I'm in a more stable space to tackle the next phase of my recovery, treating the PTSD and other significant stress reactions due to past trauma and invalidation. Without the DBT skills on board, touching on such issues inevitably resulted in me resorting to maladaptive coping strategies. I would love to have done the next stage of DBT, which I believe addresses these issues. However, this simply wasn't available to me. So I began seeing a trauma-informed specialist, therapist, and have made significant progress in leaps and bounds because I'm able to identify when I'm starting to dissociate or when I have an intense feeling, and I'm able to communicate my need to pause, to access my grounding and practice my grounding, mindfulness and other DBT skills. Where I previously liked to think I dwelt solely in the cognitive realm and attempted to avoid any emotional experience, which isn't particularly effective as it always comes out in maladaptive ways, I've been able to gradually increase my awareness of my somatic experience and am able to tolerate the discomfort and distress that arises from this. I'm not afraid that an emotion will overwhelm and incapacitate me, as I know that this too shall pass. I know what cognitive dissonance feels like, and although incredibly difficult, I'm able to challenge and even embrace the process, keeping in mind the question, is what I've been doing effective? Is there perhaps another way to be more effective? I'm still in the relatively early stages of this phase. I have, however, begun to glimpse the next phase, and I look forward to when I'm fully ready to launch into this in the future. So phase 4 I call building and blooming. I imagine it as a season of building a balanced, bountiful, bold, beautiful life with self-respect. It's not just about surviving, but thriving. It's accepting the highs, the lows, the in-betweens, the light and shade. It's about pursuing life goals, fulfillment and deeper meaning. It's about creating a life worth living. It's blossoming. Practically, what does that look like for me? Perhaps returning to study or engaging in the workforce, not having appointments every other day. It's something I'm finally excited to work towards. I'm not there yet, but I'm no longer overwhelmed at even entertaining the idea. And I know that recovery is possible because I'm walking that journey. From the age of about 11, I've had suicidal or self-harm thoughts virtually every day of my life. The intensity of the urge has varied considerably, and with DBT skills under my belt, they were dialed right down to a dull static in the background. Just intrusive but fleeting thoughts or images with no intent to act on them. I was able to just observe and allow them to pass, and they eventually did so in a matter of a split second. However, a few months ago, I noticed as I was filling out my DBT diary card that I hadn't had a single suicidal or self-harm thought, image or urge that day. 4 days later, I was surprised, pleasantly surprised, to notice that that trend had continued. I was super excited to share this with Vanessa, who was my case manager, and Danae, my psychologist. This was huge for me. It had been over 25 years of being inflicted with these thoughts and images daily, sometimes hundreds of times a day. And now I've just had 4 days with not a single thought, image or urge. Since that time, I've only had maybe a total of 3 or 4 days where there has been an intrusive image, thought or urge. Is it because life has been so peachy during this time? Most certainly not. I've had 5 friends die. I've been dealing with child custody and legal issues. I've had sick kids and sleepless nights, financial struggles, and a whole host of other challenges. But my default has been shifting. That gives me hope that recovery is possible. I'm walking the journey. I believe that I'm able to live a life where my maladaptive coping strategies and behaviours have been dialed down so low as to barely hear them above the sounds that are the rhythm of life. That I can be skillful and effective in my daily living, participating fully in my life, a life that has meaning. That I'm not resigned to be in and out of hospital for the rest of my life. So I've pretty much given DBT a bit of a plug, but I also just want to mention a few key points on what else has